An alternative to the US dollar, but are the euro or the yuan ready to be alternatives?
Haslinda, we tend to forget that we've done this before. 20 years ago, the whole world was using the German Deutschmark, the French franc, the Italian lira, and we were all able to change our habit and start using what has now become the euro, right? Now, the euro did not create itself. It was proactively created by policymakers. So that kind of proactive and innovative policy is once again needed today, with everybody pulling together to shift the burden away from the US dollar and towards the euro, the yen, and yes, the Chinese renminbi.
Well, we talk about the yuan, and we have Mnuchin saying, you know what, perhaps there's competitive devaluation. With such accusations or concerns, would the yuan be ready to be an alternative currency?
I think Secretary Mnuchin's comments underscore the urgency of this kind of currency diversification. There is, in fact, way too much of a burden on the US dollar, right? Other countries, other economies have to step up. People tend to focus too much on the supposed benefits of being a reserve currency issuer, but actually it comes with a lot of burdens, as we see from Secretary Mnuchin's and even President Trump's complaints, which in many cases are valid.
What do you make of the weakening rupiah? No matter what the central bank does to support it, 5 interest rate hikes, 150 basis point hike, the rupiah is still at 15,000.
You know, there's a short-term, a medium-term, and a long-term cycle to these things, Haslinda. 3 years ago, when I first joined the cabinet as trade minister, was the last time that the rupiah was plumbing these levels, and it triggered a burst of reform, and then the rupiah recovered. Our central bank reserves replenished and grew strongly. And I have every expectation that the currency will stabilize and rebound just like it did 3 years ago and just like it did 5 years ago. So this is not unexpected.
Being the investment chief, has it been difficult for you to convince investors that this is still the right investment destination?
Well, in my capacity, I'm focused on FDI, and that is by nature long-term investment. So thankfully, the fundamentals and the reform trajectory, right, the trajectory of modernization are still fully intact. So Indonesia, as a long-term investment destination, continues to be, one of the most attractive in the world. This is not me. This is various surveys like the United Nations UNCTAD international survey routinely places Indonesia in the top 4, sometimes even top 2. And that is because of ongoing modernization, technology, and structural reform.
How important is China's FDI? Because FDI from China has doubled that of the U.S. now, about $1.3 billion. Is China becoming more important than the U.S.? Can you put that in perspective for us?
Again, that's an excellent phrase, Haslinda. Let's put things in perspective. We tend to become overly focused on what I call flow, and we often forget about stock. American companies, European companies, Japanese companies, Korean companies started investing in Indonesia 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Their stock of investment in Indonesia is gigantic. The Chinese are relative newcomers. Yes, today they dominate the annual flow, but frankly, the Americans, the Europeans, the Koreans, the Japanese have a huge head start. They have a massive presence in our country and are contributing a lot to our economic development and to our exports.
What kind of growth are you looking at in terms of Chinese FDI to Indonesia?
I think it's going to continue at 2 to 3 times our GDP growth. So our GDP is growing in the neighborhood of 5% per year. I fully expect Chinese FDI into Indonesia to continue growing at 10-15% per year.
In his speech this morning, President Joko Widodo talked about winter coming for the global economy. How is Indonesia preparing for this winter?
Sorry to sound like a broken record, but there is no magic bullet, there is no shortcut other than reform. Ultimately, it always comes back to reform. Structural reform, market opening, supply-side reforms, reforms to our education system and our capital markets, reforming our banking sector and industries where there's monopolies and inefficiencies. There's no other way. And again, I'm hopeful that the current market pressures and the currency turmoil are creating a renewed focus on reform.
Do you think the worst is over for emerging markets like Indonesia?
Personally, I would not be surprised if over the next 2 months or so, we will see more turmoil, right? So
because of normalization?
Yes, because of monetary normalization, but also because the Federal Reserve and the world's major central banks are finally achieving what they set out to do, which is to begin to deflate some of these asset bubbles. And when these asset bubbles, like hugely overvalued technology stocks, start to deflate, it's always painful. There's always side effects and innocent bystanders. So personally, I would urge continued vigilance for all emerging markets, certainly over the next 2 months.